Hello everyone, my name is Ken Bowser. Today I'm going to talk briefly about the history of the Zodiac. In this lecture, I'll show you how the Babylonians developed the Zodiac. I'll also show you how the discovery of ancient astronomical and astrological tablets in modern-day Iraq led to a new branch of astrology, Western sidereal astrology, which, as it turns out, in its earliest rendering, is actually the oldest. There are two main types of astrology commonly practiced in the world: tropical and sidereal. The main difference between tropical and sidereal astrology is their point of reference. Tropical astrology reckons positions of bodies from the northern hemisphere vernal equinox. That refers to the limits of the sun's declination cycle that define the seasons. It's disconnected from the stars as a frame of reference. Sidereal astrology reckons positions of bodies from the stars. In this system, the zodiac is defined by the stars themselves, and is disconnected from the seasons in this era as a frame of reference. There are two main types of sidereal astrology, Eastern and Western. Eastern sidereal astrology is known as Indian or Vedic astrology, which came out of the Indus River Valley civilization in India. Western sidereal astrology developed in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley civilization in ancient Babylon and Assyria in what is now modern Iraq, during the first 3 millennia BC. To get you oriented with respect to place, the modern city of Baghdad on the Tigris River in central Iraq is 60 miles to the northwest of the ruins of Babylon on the Euphrates River at 32 north 33 and 44 east 26. The modern city of Mosul in northern Iraq is at 36 north 20 and 43 east 08. It's built nearly on top of the ruins of Nineveh, the capital of ancient Assyria. Both Eastern and Western branches employed the sidereal zodiac, but Indian and Babylonian methodologies are quite different. The layout of modern Western sidereal is similar to tropical, with the sidereal zodiac position employed instead of the tropical. The sidereal zodiac was employed in the ancient world because you can hang your hat on a star that has become oriented in space, whereas equinoxes and solstices are hard to measure, and worse, they move against the near-constant backdrop of the stars. There is no sign in the sky that says vernal equinox here. The greatest tropical astrologer of late antiquity was Claudius Ptolemy, whose astronomical and astrological works are unquestionably the best of his era. All of his measurements of the equinoxes are wrong, although some of them not by much. But the point is that even by his day in the 2nd century of the current era, the equinoxes were approximate. The phenomenon of precession is the mechanism that separates tropical from sidereal reckoning. Due to the gravitational pull on the Earth's equatorial bulge, primarily exerted by the Sun and the Moon, and to a lesser degree by Jupiter and Saturn, the Earth's spin axis precesses with a period of 25,800 years. The spin axis of a child's spinning top precesses in the same way, to give you an idea of what that looks like. The effect of precession is that the equinox is pointed at a different 30-degree segment of the zodiac about every 2,150 years. For example, we're in the age of Pisces right now. Slightly less than 5 degrees of Pisces rises in this era at the northern hemisphere vernal equinox with respect to sidereal reckoning. The entire tropical sidereal debate is a result of Ptolemy's confidence, and the confidence of the ancient Greeks who preceded him, in the total immobility of the Earth. That is, that the sky was moving with respect to a motionless Earth. The Babylonians had no such model and were totally unaware of precession. The zodiac and the first ephemerides were developed in Mesopotamia over a period of many centuries. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers in Greek. It refers to Babylonia, Assyria, Sumeria, and all the city-states in the Tigris and Euphrates watershed that drains into the Persian Gulf. The developments of the zodiac and ephemerides in this region are celebrated by historians of science as two of the greatest technical achievements of antiquity. The determination of how the zodiac was discovered all happened within the last 150 years, because Akkadian, the language of the Babylonians, wasn't sufficiently understood to unlock ancient cuneiform texts until the 1870s. The tablets that led directly to Western sidereal astrology were excavated in the 1840s in what is now Iraq. Most of them reside today in the British Museum in London. The history of Western sidereal astrology has three parts. The Babylonian period, from the 3rd millennium BC to the 1st century AD, the dormant period, that comprises most of the last 2 millennia, and the renewal that began in the 19th century. The 3rd millennium BC data are extremely sparse and simple with respect to astronomy and astrology. There are no ephemerides, no zodiac, and no mathematical treatment of the sky. Although in Egypt, the sky was organized in a manner somewhat unfamiliar to modern people. The Egyptians were oriented to the equator, that is the celestial equator, which is the Earth's equator extended off the planet into space as a reference plane. The equatorial system, also known as the right ascension and declination system, is subject to precession. That's why, incidentally, according to J. Norman Lockyer in his Dawn of Astronomy, the Egyptians disassembled and rebuilt temples to receive the light of the most important stars in their pantheon onto the altars of those temples, as the declinations of the stars precessed away from much older positions. Modern tropical astrologers are familiar with the celestial equator because it intersects the ecliptic at the equinoxes. But except for that, the equator is ignored by most astrologers, although much used by siderealists. The equator was much more emphasized in the ancient world than it is now. In the ancient world, it was understood and widely employed, especially in Egypt and China. Plato described the equator and the ecliptic as like the letter chi, laid on its side, which is a good way to look at it. But as a practical matter, there is no hard evidence for ecliptic emphasis in the 3rd millennium BC. Therefore, we can write off the 3rd millennium BC for anything definitive that relates to the zodiac until and if new evidence is uncovered. Astronomical data in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC are also extremely sparse. They can't, strictly speaking, be called astrology. The Venus tablet of Amazigduka, which recorded 21 years of the heliacal risings and settings of Venus, is the principal work of the early part of the 2nd millennium known to date. The heliacal rising or setting of a body is its first appearance after a period of invisibility and its last appearance before a period of invisibility. Heliacal phenomena were important to the Babylonians because horizon phenomena are definite with respect to time, position, and place. Amazigduka was the 4th king of the dynasty founded by the well-known king Hammurapi, whose dates are 1792 to 1750 BC. Amazigduka's dates are unknown, but the latest works on the Venus tables suggest that they date from 1702 BC. The Venus tablet marks the beginning, or at least the first known record, of the recognition that celestial phenomena are periodic. A Babylonian text known as the Prayer to the Gods of the Night, which dates from approximately 1700 BC, addresses only 4 constellations, 3 other single stars, and 1 star group, the Pleiades. The Pleiades were, from a very early time, the most important asterism in the Babylonian pantheon of stars, probably because they rose with the vernal equinox during the last 2 centuries of the 3rd millennium BC, with the beginning of the constellation Taurus. Precession is a westward or backward movement. One sees the last part of a constellation first at the equinox and the first part last. All that remains of data from the Old Babylonian period, which is 2000 to 1500 BC, are lunar eclipse omina and month lengths in administrative and economic texts. The Babylonian month was always either 29 or 30 days, depending on the appearance of the moon after sunset, the day after the new moon, that is the actual syzygy, which is invisible. Babylon was sacked and entered into a dark age when the city was conquered by the Hittites in 1595 BC from Anatolia, which is modern Turkey. Babylon came under Assyrian control by 1220 BC, when astronomical developments apparently resumed at a more noteworthy pace. Inasmuch as there isn't a lot to say about the period 1595 to 1220 BC. The precursor of the zodiac developed slowly but continuously during the Assyrian period via sky lore. Seeing conditions were perfect in the arid Mesopotamian plain with no light pollution whatever outside the city of Babylon. It was during the period 1300 through 1100 BC that most of the Mesopotamian constellations were derived, and during which a massive compendium came into use known as the Enuma Anu Enlil series after the first three words of its introduction. That is, Enuma Anu Enlil means when the gods Anu and Enlil ... It contains thousands of omens in 70 tablets that mostly relate to the moon, plus a lot of sky lore. The sky lore was extremely important because it helped to develop an increasing knowledge of what can be described as positional astronomy. It was continuously developed for half a millennium. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa is tablet number 63 of the Enuma Anu Enlil compendium that was built upon all previous knowledge of the sky. Progress during this 1300 through 1100 BC period that contributed to the solution of the zodiac was facilitated by the development of what are called astrolabes, but they're not devices that can give a planispheric projection. Rather, they merely note the positions of stars and planets, but they were very important as observational records and to develop the organization of the sky. They entail rising and setting arcs along the eastern and western horizon traversed by stars and planets. These were known as the paths of Anu, Ea, and Enlil. They can be seen as declination circles or circles of position for those familiar with navigation. Declination, just to refresh your memory, is a measure of the distance above or below the celestial equator. A tablet known as the 36 Stars came into use in the latter part of the second millennium BC. It was better known as 3 stars each because the Babylonians connected 3 stars with each month of the year. They were originally calendar stars that were used to tell time at night, similar to the Egyptian decans that were also equatorial and likewise used to tell time at night. 3 stars each texts also deal with constellations, star lore, planetary schema, and intercalation of the calendar. Intercalation was important because there are only 12 new months in a lunar year. A lunar year is only 354 days long, and you have to add a 13th month slightly more often than every 3 years in order for the months not to rotate through the seasons like the modern Islamic calendar does. A major new compendium called Mul Apin is the earliest general work on astronomy known as of today that mentions the ecliptic. It was composed at an unknown date in the early part of the first millennium BC. Zodiac reckoning had not appeared anywhere else in the world up to this time. Mul Apin means plow star, which is a reference to what is known today as the Big Dipper. It's a compilation of 66 stars and constellations. It contains a great deal of astronomical content that relates to how the Babylonians got oriented in the sky with respect to their supreme achievement, the zodiac. Mul Apin makes frequent reference to a celestial phenomenon particular to its time known as an astronomical calendar. So what's that, and why is it important? Nearly 3,000 years ago, 4 astounding seasonal and sidereal alignments that were exact in the 9th century BC took place, which were instrumental in the development of what modern scholars call an ideal calendar. Specifically, on the day of the winter solstice, which was December 29th, 871 BC Julian, the sun's maximum declination south was 23 degrees, 47 minutes, 47 seconds, and at the same time, the sun's celestial longitude had 15 Capricorn, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, precisely in the middle of the southernmost of what are now called the cardinal sidereal signs with respect to Fig and Allen reckoning. On the day of the summer solstice, on July 2nd, 870 BC, Julian, the sun's maximum declination north was 23 degrees, 47 minutes, 48 seconds, and at the same time, its celestial longitude was 15 Cancer, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds in the exact to the second middle of the northernmost of what are now called the cardinal sidereal signs. Think about that for a minute, because it sounds outrageous, but it's easily verified. The sun's declination was 0 degrees, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds on October 1st, 864 BC Julian, at the autumnal equinox, as the sun moved from north to south declination. At the moment of the equinox, the celestial longitude of the sun was 15 degrees Libra, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds, precisely in the middle of what are now called the cardinal sidereal signs. The sun's declination was 0 degrees, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds on March 29th, 863 BC Julian, at the vernal equinox, as the sun moved from south to north declination. At the moment of the equinox, the celestial longitude of the sun was 15 Aries, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds, precisely in the middle of what are now called the cardinal sidereal signs. Between 1050 BC and 700 BC, the equinoxes and solstices fell within 2.5 degrees of the middles of the cardinal sidereal signs, Capricorn, Cancer, Libra, and Aries. The Babylonians did not confuse the calendar with the zodiac. It's important to grasp that this was probably more than a calendar because it paralleled the zodiac. Yet the sidereal zodiac was always aligned to the stars, which is proved as the positions of stars were not changed as precession carried the equinoxes and solstices away from the middles of the signs. The long life of the ideal calendar and its widespread use may be demonstrated by the statement of Eudoxos, whose dates are approximately 400 BC to 350 BC, that the equinoxes and solstices fall in the middle of the signs, which was wildly wrong for his time. Toward the end of his lifetime, the equinoxes appeared in 8 degrees of the sidereal signs. Eudoxos was the first Greek to develop a geometric model of the solar system. It was quite inaccurate, but a significant achievement nonetheless. He would have known, as an intellectual, and because it's obvious to anyone who looks, that the equinoxes did not hold 15 degrees of the signs in his day. He was probably referring to the ideal calendar. The fact, however, that the Babylonians grasped that the solstices and equinoxes were in alignment with the signs at a formative period in the development of the zodiac suggests that the 12-fold equal extent sidereal signs existed simultaneously alongside the constellational zodiac, which it gradually displaced. In other words, this calendar is suggestive that the 12-fold equal-length signs were in place earlier than 500 BC. This is important because some scholars insist that the 12-fold equal division zodiac didn't exist before 500 BC. The ideal calendar suggests otherwise. Mul Apin contains a great deal of specific astronomical information. The most important elements are several lists of the dates of the heliacal risings and settings of the stars, lists of stars that culminate and rise simultaneously as others set, which are what are known today as parans, which is short for the Greek verb paranatello, that means to rise side by side or near, also the number of days between those events. It contains a list of stars and the path of the moon through which the sun and the planets travel. In other words, the ecliptic, not the equator. There's no record of ecliptic usage anywhere else before the first millennium BC. Mul Apin notes how far north and south of east the sun rises that correspond to the changes in the length of daylight, as well as the dates of the equinoxes and solstices, and several mathematical schemes that relate to the calendar and the visibility of the moon, and quite a lot more that is beyond the scope of a quick introductory talk. But the pièce de résistance for us as astrologers is that Mul Apin contains a list of 18 unequal length constellations, 14 were on the ecliptic, but 4 of them were not. They are the 12 that we use today, but with Pisces in 2 pieces, the eastern and western fishes as separate constellations. And with the addition of the Pleiades, Perseus, Orion, Auriga, and a constellation the Babylonians called the Swallow, near Andromeda, between the eastern and western fishes in Pisces. The critical element here is that the ecliptic as a reference frame is mentioned explicitly. Nobody knows yet when ecliptic emphasis completely displaced equatorial emphasis. They almost surely operated simultaneously for a long time. It's unknown when the zodiac was consolidated from 18 unequal length constellations to 12 equal length signs when Perseus, Auriga, and the Swallow, which are all well north of the ecliptic, were dropped from the zodiac, obviously because they're not ecliptic constellations. Likewise, Orion, whose bright stars are all on and near the equator, well south of the ecliptic, was also dropped, and the Pleiades, because its stars are within the bounds of the zodiac, were incorporated into Taurus. The introduction of Mul Apin marks the beginning of the slow transition from the equatorial orientation of the declination circles of Enuma Anu and Enlil to a strictly ecliptic-oriented scheme that corresponded to what the Babylonians thought was the true configuration of heaven. Later, at an unknown date, the Babylonians also developed a technique called period relations, which was extensively incorporated into the first ephemerides. They're built around the sidereal and synodic periods of the planets. Period relations are known as the Greek letter phenomena by the academics who assigned Greek letters to the synodic phenomena. A synodic period is the amount of time required for successive conjunctions of a star or planet with the sun, as seen from the Earth. For example, Jupiter's synodic period is 398.88 days. A sidereal period is the amount of time required for a planet to orbit the sun, as seen from the Earth. Jupiter's orbital period, for example, is 11.86223 years. When sidereal and synodic periods coincide, which with most of the planets takes centuries, their synodic phenomena repeat very closely in terms of date and follow in the same sequence even centuries later in the same part of the zodiac, almost to the degree. In the case of Jupiter, 36 orbits of the planet and 391 synodic periods are completed in 427 years. If you know a planet's period relation with respect to sidereal reckoning, you'll know its future positions accurately. Period relations are quite inaccurate with tropical reckoning because that system doesn't take precession into account. The synodic phenomena, or Greek letter phenomena, for an outer planet are the first appearance of a body after a period of invisibility, called gamma, its first stationary point, called theta, its opposition to the sun, called psi, its second stationary point, called phi, and the last appearance in the west before a period of invisibility is omega. The synodic phenomena for the inner planets are the same except for the opposition to the sun. By the 7th century BC, Babylonian records included what modern scholars call the lunar 3 and the lunar 6, first at the beginning, then the middle, and at the end of the lunar month, and then every day. These record the time differences between the rising and setting of the sun and moon in relation to each other. The lunar 6 contributed toward the development of the first ephemerides. The lunar 6 also led to the discovery of the difference between the sidereal month, which is the period fixed star to fixed star, 27 days, 7 hours, 43 minutes, and 12 seconds, and the anomalistic month, which is the period from the moon's perigee to perigee, 27 days, 13 hours, 18 minutes, and 33 seconds. With the moon's anomaly in hand, the Babylonians figured out the so-called Metonic cycle, which is 19 years equals 235 synodic months. A synodic month is the period new moon to new moon, 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3 seconds. And from there, the Babylonians derived the length of the draconic month, which is the length of the period of the moon's node to its previous node. 27 days, 5 hours, 5 minutes, and 36 seconds. This is important because it underscores ecliptic usage, and is therefore sophisticated because the nodes of the moon are invisible. That is, the node is the intersection of the moon's orbit with the ecliptic, which was not used anywhere before the Babylonians became aware of it. It's called the Draconic Month, after the circumpolar constellation Draco the Dragon that marks the north ecliptic pole. With the length of the Draconic Month determined, the Babylonians discovered the Saros cycle, which is 223 synodic months exactly, and 241.999 draconian months, or 18 years and 10, 11, or 12 days depending on leap year. After one Saros cycle, the Sun, Moon, and Earth return to the same positions with respect to the sidereal zodiac. The Babylonian values of the 4 months were accurate to within seconds of their modern values. These 4 values, the synodic month, the sidereal month, the anomalistic month, and the draconian month, are the keys to eclipse prediction. When all this came together exactly is unknown, although the scholars I have read claim that this was all well in hand by 500 BC. It's a fact, however, that the earliest recorded dated observation is of a lunar eclipse that took place February 6th, 747 BC, which is Julian reckoning, of course, during the first regnal year of the Babylonian king Nabonassar, much quoted by Hipparchus and Ptolemy, who both had access to the data 600 and 900 years later, respectively. The point is that consistent daily observation, record-keeping, and assiduous study of the data over a period of centuries is what revealed these secrets. It was nothing exotic, just hard work. Einstein made the same point when he said that discovery is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, or words to that effect. The solution was in the data. The Babylonians thought the planets were gods, which in a secularized form holds true today. Otherwise, the entire premise of astrological influence collapses instantly. The number of teeth on the main gear of the Antiquity mechanism, found in a shipwreck at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea in the year 1900, is 223, which stands for the 223 synodic months in a Saros cycle. That machine was a Greek astronomical calendar, which many people think was constructed by Archimedes, which incorporated Babylonian discoveries made before the Greeks had even differentiated the planets from the stars. The planets are never mentioned in the Iliad, the Odyssey, or Hesiod works and days, much less the Zodiac, although stars are frequently mentioned in those works. Moreover, their positions in those works are stated with respect to constellations, not the tropical signs that would be invented far into the future. Many centuries of records, the ideal calendar, Greek letter phenomena, the lunar 6, and the declination circles eventually led to the identification of the locations on the ecliptic of several dozen stars fairly close to the ecliptic, known as normal stars or standard stars. With these long-used positions tightened up, the addition of this element, the normal stars, the zodiac was brought under control. That is, one could describe the positions of bodies in the sky and calculate their positions fairly accurately. Most societies can claim an interest in the sky and some measure of star lore, but only the Babylonians had the observational data that was necessary to put all the pieces together. This is why all the various claims made by exponents of other cultures for a hand in the development of the zodiac ring hollow. The solution to the zodiac is built upon a prodigious amount of data, a database of 1,000 years, which is 365,422 days. Only the Babylonians can provide the evidence that they had it. It's taken for granted in the present day, But getting control of a model of the sky presented an exceedingly high level of difficulty 3,000 years ago. Moreover, it had not been done before. The entire scheme is built on very extensive observations over a period of many centuries, especially the data that support periodic relationships, that is, relationships that regularly repeat, and the mathematical relationships that tie them all together. Because the first Babylonian horoscope found to date, which was for an ordinary non-royal individual, can only be dated to 410 BC, it's unknown how much earlier that astrology became operational in its present form. What is explicitly stated, however, by the scholars of the last 100 years who've examined the primary source data is that classical Babylonian astrology was reserved exclusively for the king and for matters of state. It should not come as a surprise, therefore, that no earlier horoscopes have been found. There may not be any for non-royal individuals before the 5th century BC. Yet astrology was definitely in use, for example, at the court of Marduk-Nadi-Mahé, who ruled Babylon from 1099 to 1082 BC. Its form and level of sophistication is the point at issue. All scholars emphasize that astrology didn't issue fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus. That is, astrology is a good deal older than the 410 BC period. When the transition from 18 unequal constellations to 12 equally spaced sidereal signs occurred is hard to pin down, probably because both traditions existed side by side for an unknown length of time. The matter is debated in academic circles. Some modern academics claim that the Zodiac is no older than 500 BC. Against that, an example that can be dated is the Esarhaddon chronicle, which precedes the 410 BC horoscope by more than 2.5 centuries, which constitutes persuasive textual proof that the 12-fold equal division zodiac was in place long before the beginning of the 5th century BC. Babylon was conquered and razed to the ground by Sennacherib, king of Assyria, early in the 7th century BC. Warfare between the two states was endemic throughout their history. Sennacherib was murdered by his sons in 681 BC, who wanted the throne for themselves. One of the sons, the crown prince Esarhaddon, was not part of the plot and immediately took up arms against his brothers, which became a civil war, won by Esarhaddon by the end of 680 BC. Esarhaddon was king of Assyria from 680 BC to 669 BC. He was succeeded by his more famous son, Ashurbanipal, of the illustrious library, to get you plugged into the era. The Esarhaddon Chronicle speaks to the heliacal rising of Jupiter in June of 680 BC, but more importantly, it is one of the earliest texts to mention the Ashar Nesirti, better known as the exaltations or hiding places, called the hypsomata by the Greeks. In the Esarhaddon Chronicle is the following statement. In the month of Simanu, that is June, 680 BC, bright Jupiter, which makes decisions for Akkad, approached the place where the sun lights up, and stood there shining. Its rising was perfect, like the rising of the sun. The angry gods became reconciled with the land of Akkad. There was plenty of rain and regular flooding in the land of Akkad. It, that is Jupiter, then doubled its course, and in the month of Pet Babi, which is October of 680 BC, it reached its Ashar Nesirti, that is its exaltation, which is its hypsomata, and stayed in its house. The first part of that statement relates to Jupiter's heliacal rising in June, which was an important event for the Babylonian state. You can see that in terms of Babylonian reckoning, which is to say modern Fagan-Allen reckoning, that on October 26, 680 BC, the day Jupiter turned retrograde, that it's stationed in 14 degrees 36 minutes Cancer, less than a half degree from its precise exaltation degree, which is 15 Cancer 00. Take a minute and look at this. See Jupiter on the descendant. The tropical version of this is shown next with Jupiter just inside tropical Cancer. The next slide shows Jupiter on the day of its direct station at 4 Cancer in terms of sidereal reckoning, which demonstrates that Jupiter stayed in its own sign as per the chronicle text, because Jupiter's retrograde arc is always 10 degrees. Last is the tropical rendering of Jupiter in its direct station at 22 Gemini, having retrograded out of its house, which shows that the text could not be tropical. Look at this for a moment. You can see that Jupiter was well into tropical Gemini. This is important in 4 ways. First, the Esarhaddon chronicle text is only descriptive of what happened if the 12-fold equal division zodiac were in place in 680 BC. Second, it strongly suggests that the locations of the exaltations were already a tradition by that date. Third, it shows that the Babylonians considered that a planet that retrograded out of its sign during its retrograde arc to be distinctly unlucky. And fourth, these events could not be tropical. The reason that position of Jupiter was so important for Esarhaddon was due to the civil war that had been raging in Assyria since the death of his father Sennacherib. Jupiter in its exaltation, because astrology was only for the king, meant that the legitimate ruler would win out, which is what happened. The heyday of sidereal astrology was the second half of the first millennium BC, as ephemerides became more accurate and the fame of Babylonian astrology spread throughout the Mediterranean world. But near the beginning of the Christian era, Babylon had fallen to ruin, which may have been due to extreme prolonged drought in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, although the Greek general Seleucus, who took over Babylonia after the death of Alexander in 323 BC, moved his capital out of Babylon, which also radically reduced its population. Babylon lived on the edge of barely enough rainfall to sustain a large population, and as in Egypt, depended on the annual spring floods to fill catch basins and to irrigate their fields. Only a modest decrease in annual rainfall over a period of a few decades would have been more than enough to all but destroy civilization there. The last datable text in cuneiform from the region is from AD 75. Sidereal astrology survived in India but disappeared from the Near East and the West until re-embraced by Muslim astrologers many hundreds of years later, most of whom were tropicalists. The dormant period for sidereal astrology lasted until the 1840s, when a British archaeologist, Austin Henry Laird, got permission from the Ottoman government to excavate in their Baghdad province. He brought home to England a treasure trove of cuneiform tablets and other artifacts. The most dramatic items he shipped to England were the huge 30-ton winged bulls, which he sent home in 1846, that reside today in the British Museum in London. The greatest treasure was the tablets, with astronomical and astrological content that didn't begin to be understood until the 1870s. The number of Babylonian cuneiform texts in the British Museum exceeds 100,000. The revival of sidereal astrology in the West was brought about quite recently by Cyril Fagin, one of very few master astrologers of the 20th century, who realized in 1944, after 20 years of study, that astrology had been sidereal in the ancient world before Greek influence was felt late in the first millennium BC, probably during the lifetime of Hipparchus of Rhodes. The information that swayed him from tropical ranks had only become available in his lifetime via Laird and the first generation of modern Assyriologists, all Jesuits: Joseph Epping, Johann Strassmayer, Francis Xavier Kugler, and Joseph Schaumburger. The first article on the subject appeared in 1881 by Professor Epping, entitled Zur Entzifferung der astronomischen Tafeln der Chaldaer, on deciphering the Chaldean astronomical tables. followed in 1889 by his Astronomisches aus Babylon, astronomical material from Babylon. Once Akkadian was opened up, the field began to provide academic careers, and still does. Fagin devoured their publications, even though he was a tropicalist, and finally was moved to adopt the sidereal stance after experimentation. The resurgence of sidereal astrology in the West is due primarily to his efforts. He is called the father of Western sidereal astrology. Fagin realized that sidereal astrology was displaced for reasons that had nothing to do with its intrinsic merit. Sidereal astrology disappeared from the West and the Near East for three reasons. First, tropical and sidereal reckoning coincide once every 25,800 years approximately, which by chance happened in the 3rd century of the current era. Second, when that happened, the West was on the precipice of a profoundly dark age that was a huge step backward compared to the sophistication of late antiquity. People in the Roman West didn't realize that the Earth-sky relationship would change, which is no surprise, as the summer solstice in AD 354 by Roman time was already 2 days out of synchronization with the sun. Third, the source of greatest astrological sophistication disappeared when Babylon was abandoned, because nobody in the West could read Akkadian, which is the antecedent of modern Arabic. Ancient knowledge was lost. Western Europe became a backwater. When the lights came on again in the 11th century AD in the West, the last rendering of astrology among the Greeks when the lights went out was re-embraced. That was tropical astrology. Fagin's work, via his 3 books and 17-year-long column in American Astrology magazine, aroused both strong opposition to sidereal astrology and, strange to say, greater enthusiasm for our art than at any time since the 17th century. Fagin's battles in magazines 50 years ago, mostly in Horoscope and American Astrology magazine, especially with Dane Rudyard, produced a hotbed of interest in astrology that was part and parcel of the wild 1960s. Now for resources on Western sidereal astrology. I have several books on this topic. The book on the left, An Introduction to Western Sidereal Astrology, was my first book, now in its 3rd edition. This book includes the basics of Western sidereal astrology, a chapter on mundane aspects, and 3 appendices that touch upon the history of sidereal astrology, the tropical sidereal debate, and the explanation of the exaltations. The centerpiece of the book is the delineation of the 45 planet combinations, which can be used by both sidereal and tropical astrologers. The middle book is my interpretation course on Western sidereal astrology. In this course, I walk students through the interpretation of 25 horoscopes and show them how to incorporate mundane aspects and stars into their interpretations. This course is for intermediate and advanced students of astrology. The charts use Western sidereal longitude, but the course is also suitable for tropical astrologers since the same rules of interpretation apply to both schools. The book on the right is on primary directions. Primary directions were mentioned by Ptolemy and were much used by medieval astrologers, especially to verify or find birth times before clocks became accurate. They're one of the most accurate timing tools in astrology. Directions move the angles of the chart, the horizon and the meridian, in right ascension, which is how the angles are derived. They're different than progressions, which move the planets from their natal positions. Directions move the angles to the planets. The appendix of this book includes instructions on how to do primary directions. Primary directions are the same in both zodiacs and can be used by both tropical and sidereal astrologers. There will be 2 primary directions to the U.S. chart this year. That is the fall of 2022. It's not unheard of, but quite unusual to have 2 in the same year. The Sun is closely square Saturn in the ecliptic system in the U.S. chart, and even more closely square Neptune in the equatorial system. They have been problematic from the point of view of debt in the past, which is what is looming now. In mundo aspects are much used by Western sidereal astrologers, and I have a free hour-long lecture on this subject on my website. In mundo aspects are one of the most sophisticated tools in an astrologer's toolbox, and they can be used by both sidereal and tropical astrologers. They allow us to see a chart in 2 dimensions. In mundo aspects show the hidden aspects you'll miss when looking at a chart only in the ecliptic system. The lecture provides an introduction to mundane aspects and explains how they're used in astrological interpretation. It includes the use of the speculum, which is a list of the sidereal times with which planets rise, culminate, set, and anticulminate. The speculum is the essential tool for finding aspects in mundo. The 2 chart examples are Napoleon and Kamala Harris. Napoleon's achievements are not obvious from his zodiac situation alone. His horoscope really comes into view when you include his aspects in mundo. The book on the left is in progress. I'm updating Cyril Fagan's first book, Zodiac's Old and New. It was published in 1950 and has long been out of print. Since Fagan's death in 1970, new information has come to light that supports Fagan's arguments about the antiquity of the sidereal zodiac. The book on the right will be our first in a 4-volume series. This series will include all the Solinar's articles from American Astrology magazine. This column, which ran from 1953 until his death in 1970, has been called the greatest astrology book ever written. James Eshelman's books and his Solinar's website are also valuable resources. This concludes my talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for listening. If you'd like to be informed when the books are available, please go to my website and sign up for our mailing list.